Welcome to the Recovery.com podcast. Join us as we navigate the nuances of recovery, featuring heartfelt stories, expert insights, and the latest breakthroughs in mental health and healing. Whether you're taking the first step or continuing your recovery journey, we're here and hope to support, inform, and inspire you. I'm your host, Editor-in-Chief at Recovery.com, Dr. Mala Chaudhry Malgeri. I'm joined by fellow host and Chief Growth Officer at Recovery.com, Cliff McDonald. I'm also joined by fellow host and Chief of Staff, Amanda Uphoff. Today, we were thrilled to sit down with our very own Terry McGuire, host of the Giving Voice to Depression podcast. Terry, a former Milwaukee news anchor, turned her deepest struggles with depression and the heartbreak of losing loved ones to suicide into a powerful mission. In 2017, she founded the nonprofit Giving Voice to Mental Illness, Inc., and launched the Giving Voice to Depression podcast, where she uses her reporting skills to share stories that bring connection, hope, and crucial conversations about mental health into the light. Terry, welcome. It is such an honor and pleasure to have you on with us today.
Thank you so much. I love that you use the term crucial conversations, because so many people call them awkward or difficult, and I'm like, no, they're necessary. So I appreciate that.
For sure. And I'm just going to say this right now. Thank you for even starting everything and all that you do. I mean, such wonderful work. And I know we're going to get into that. So, but thank you in advance.
Thank you. It is my honor, literally. Yes.
So you have a very interesting and intricate journey. Can you tell us how everything blossomed? You know, what was the transition from news reporting and the life that you were in into this world of mental health advocacy? It's very profound. So what was that transition?
Mental health was certainly not something I expected to ever be involved in. It is not something that was acknowledged, discussed. It was on my radar, and that I was aware of it. I was aware my parents had conditions that were undiagnosed and untreated, but we sure didn't talk about them or anything else. So it wasn't until I had my own worst experience of depression and was surprised by it. How deep it was, how dark it was, how long it lasted, how I'll say poorly in the judgment in that, but how poorly everybody handled it. You know, nobody who was well said to me, hey, maybe you have depression and maybe you should get it checked. But also, I surprised myself because I'd had it before. I'd been treated before. I'd been medicated before. I'd seen therapists before. And when this one came, it's like I'd never even heard the word depression before. No part of me thought, oh, here we are again, like I would with any other illness that I've had before. Like, oh, I think I'm getting another sinus infection, another strep throat, whatever. But I didn't do that with this. So when I came out of it, which was the better part of 2 years, then I started thinking, wow, I can't be the only person who's really taken down by this and isn't even naming it and isn't getting the support and help they need. And so I started thinking, what would have helped? And I thought it would have helped for me to hear, again, like you do with every other illness, right? It's like, oh, I threw my back out, and this helped, or, this kind of an x-ray or test or doctor or chiropractor or whomever. That doesn't happen with mental illness. So I thought a discussion about it would help with someone else with lived experience. And as I went through that process, I was like, oh no, that someone just might be me. And I was like, no, I mean, I'm so tired and I just crawled out of this and I had, not made much money in those 2 years because you sound like you feel. And, I was auditioning for things that required energy. And I was sounding like someone who had just crawled out of bed to do the audition. So when I realized it, in fact, was me because of my background, telling stories, interviewing people, editing audio, doing voiceovers, I started it and just said, well, guess this is what I got to do now. So I didn't expect, I think I'm coming up on 8 years. So I didn't expect that. But as I said, honored to still be doing it.
Absolutely. So what got the podcast going? I know it was your own journey and you had several, realizations along the way, but I know that there were some hardships and certainly experiences that you had within the family that led you down that path. What was it like, not only as an individual who was going through it with yourself, but also to see people who are close to you go through it?
Yes, I've had 2 suicides in my family, but I did not have a front row seat to those struggles. And because of the people who are closer in relation to the people who ended their lives, those people don't talk about it and they're not comfortable with me talking about it. So it's like the one thing I don't talk about. But it impacted me, because you realize that you were having those thoughts that it's not we're so close, but you just realize that that's a symptom that people don't talk about. We all know sad. You think, oh, everybody with depression is sad. They look sad, they talk sad, they move sad, they feel sad. You should try looking for stock photos for depression. They are all just just Eeyores. Everybody just has this ridiculous sad look on their face. But I have depression. I'm sitting here talking to you and, I can smile and I can laugh. And there were times I had to do that when I was in the middle of it. So I think it was just realizing once I realized what I had and started talking, not like on a stage, but just even with my friends, then I would hear, oh, my blank has that mother, father, sister, brother, friend, uncle. And the more I realized we all had these experiences and suicides, lots and lots of the people I know have lost people they love dearly. And everybody, then I realized, had a story. And I realized that everybody's story could help somebody else through the telling of it and the hearing of it. I really thought it was but primarily for the listener, and that somebody would hear someone else tell a story similar enough to their own that they could learn from it and take some comfort in it. But it's the telling of it has great power too. And I wasn't aware that we would actually become a part of someone's mental health journey. But many of our guests, and there are hundreds, have stayed in touch, and, they'll check in and just say, how are you doing? Or pop over to the Facebook community and make a comment. And so I think that it's just sort of realizing I certainly have my own lived experience personally and in my family and friend groups, but that everybody does, because it's a common illness, even if it is a stigmatized one.
Yeah. Terry, it's great to have you here. And I'm going to be vulnerable in a couple of ways. Number one, with your unbelievable podcast, I feel like this is a student asking the master here. So
yeah,
I'm feeling like I'm really not, I don't know if I'm qualified to do this, but I am someone in long-term recovery. I do have lived experience. I'm in recovery from substance use disorder. I'm comfortable saying I'm a recovering alcoholic. I never was diagnosed as dual diagnosis, but I'm certain that there was a heavy amount of depression involved there. I think it's really hard to be severely alcoholic and not be depressed. And what comes first and any and all of that, we're so multifaceted, right? And it's always complex. The suicidal ideation for me was never real, right? This is how I'm going to plan it. But it did get to the point where I didn't care if I was alive or not. Like if you would have asked me at that time, are you okay if you don't wake up tomorrow? I probably might have been like, yeah, that's okay, which scares me. And that's so crazy. So now I know that I'm living a life in recovery. I know that. I don't know that many people who have been treated for clinical depression that are in long-term recovery. First of all, is that a thing? Is that appropriate, right? Saying I'm in recovery from depression. And what does that recovery look like?
Recovery isn't a term I used much before learning about Recovery.com. And it's interesting because I might have even thought, you don't recover, you manage, right? It's not as with an addiction or substance use disorder, it's not like, okay, I'm done with that. I describe it as hearing the Jaws music. dun, 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 dun. It's just like, oh, you have to be aware of your early warning signs and triggers and whatever other words you want to use so that you can stay a step ahead of it. I have not been in a serious depression since that. I think that there are all kinds of reasons. It was then. There are environmental reasons. There are biological reasons. For me, hormonal things were a factor. For me, recovery or management is just keeping my eyes wide open and knowing when I start to not be myself, which I find so much easier than trying to remember that list of symptoms. And I don't take a lot of comfort in discerning between whether I'm eating too much or eating too little, both of which are symptoms, sleeping too much or sleeping too little, both of which are, I don't find that terribly helpful. When I'm not myself, I recognize that. When I'm really getting mad when someone goes slow in front of me on the freeway instead of just chill out because I leave enough time to get where I'm going or change lanes. Even that's a warning sign. Waking up at 3 a.m. is a warning sign. So I just have to really watch it and be completely open to accessing my toolkit and, what things help me. And I don't care if you're busy, get out and take your walk. Make sure you're getting enough sleep. The things that help me, talk to somebody. I see a therapist regularly, but also being open to accelerating those things, saying, okay, I'm going to need to see you once a week. Saying, I think I need to go back on meds. I went off and I'm doing okay. And it's been a bit. So I'm feeling good about that choice, but I would go back on today if it was back because I know it helps put a floor beneath my feet. And I have no shame in needing what I need for this illness because I take antibiotics for other illnesses and antidepressants for this one.
Yeah, but no, that was great. And I think, like some people use the term recovering forever. I'm a recovering alcoholic, right?
Yeah,
some people use the past tense. It's really interesting, right? There are some people that will say, I'm a recovered alcoholic. And a lot of people caution against doing that because they say the disease is out there working, and one of the things I like from the 12 steps is a daily reprieve contingent on the maintenance of our spiritual condition, right? And kind of embracing that this is something that we're always going to be working against, whatever it might be. I think that can be overwhelming for some people, but I think it also can be inspiring because I think a lot of people that are putting in the work every day, every hour or whatever, there is a direct correlation, usually with a better life, right? And if we're not focused on outcomes, but just doing the work, so, well, you certainly seem, Terry, recovering, right, in abundance. So, yeah, for sure. For sure.
I love what you said about not so much worrying about the eating too much or eating too little or sleeping too much or sleeping too little, but more, do I feel like myself?
Right.
And we had an eating disorder specialist on, and she said much the same as, because, we're speaking specifically as a parent watching your child for these symptoms, or if you suspect something, it's not so much even about the eating patterns. It's about what do they still do things they love, or have they stopped seeing their favorite people or playing their sports? So I loved hearing that. Unfortunately, it can be hard until it's been going on a long time, right? To notice that, I am not the same person I was 6 months ago. When did that happen?
Yes.
And it can seem so small. So I could be in like a 2 week, like I'm a little more tired than usual. And it's easy to say every day, like, oh, it's only been a couple weeks. What is your advice for people who say that, like so many of us, like, oh, it's only been a few days or a couple weeks, or I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I think it's such a good point. And I think that it's one of the main reasons I didn't recognize myself as being depressed, because when it happens in the context of things happening in your life, I had just gone through a divorce. I had just moved somewhere where I don't know anybody. And I was going through menopause. So there was a hormonal aspect too that I had no control over. I think because those things were happening, I was already feeling pretty bad. And so to feel a little worse than pretty bad and a little worse than a little worse, you can go pretty far down before apparently go really far down before you realize like, wait, this is something different or something the same that you've had before that you weren't recognizing. I don't know how long it's advisable to wait. Dr. Mala probably has a better handle on that answer, but I wonder if it has something to do. Actually, I may ask you, Dr. Mala, because I'm used to doing the interviews. It may be when other people are starting to notice. Is it when it is less internal? Can I do that? Can I ask you when somebody should know? Should is not the right word.
Yeah, that's where I was going to get stuck is should. I think, there are several factors. That's where the diagnostics do come in, where if you're noticing that, you are sleeping too much or too little, or, you're kind of getting tethered into a perseverative loop that keeps you in a dark place. If you, of course, are going towards the narrative that is, having you lean into self-harm in any way, like these are all really big warning signs. If your loved ones are around you and noticing that, I think oftentimes the response of an individual is going to be a defensive one, no, I'm fine, like passing it off, not only because they maybe want to deny what they're putting out there and how it might be perceived, but they want to try to deny it within themselves as well. It's hard to kind of embrace that. I have my own journey with trauma, and, that in and of itself, it's like to admit that this has happened to you or that it is happening, right? There's a shame and a guilt that goes into the narrative, and how mine, developed was personalized to my field and, my culture and all of these other things. But, it's going to vary from person to person. So what I would say to the individual is look at what you're denying, right? Analyze that, break that down, and see whether or not, is this a true statement to you? Like really? So pay attention to what you're denying would be definitely something that I advise. And paying attention to what your loved ones are noticing around you, your close people, the people who know you, give it a minute. Even if you have that defensive response in the beginning, okay, it's fine, let that out, acknowledge it, but then ask yourself, wait a second, is this real? Is this happening? Should I talk about this more? The answer is always yes, PS, but, and do the analytics. Listen to yourself, analyze yourself, look at what you're denying, listen to what's happening around you and what's being said around you. That's what I would say.
And some of those symptoms, I think, are easy to miss or attribute to something else. There's a lot going on in your life. You're stressed. You're not going to sleep as well. The thoughts are the symptom that have me most concerned. That's when, if you start thinking I'm a burden, you're going to think, it seems pretty common from my experience and all the people I've talked to, that you think you'll always feel the way you feel. You will never get out of it. It will never get better. And that's where the hopelessness comes from, because how could you possibly let's do this for another decade when you're feeling miserable? But when you start having everybody would be better off without me, that is just that is in my mind and in my experience, that is a place that you need to just have all the alarms in your body and in your, mind just go off and say, that's a line I don't want to cross. That's a line I can't cross. And for me, it was that, Cliff, you brought up, do I care if I wake up in the morning? I was hoping I wouldn't, but I was never planning on ending my life. So I didn't recognize that as suicidal. It is considered passive suicidality. And, it's way on that end. It's still dangerous. It's still on that spectrum, and you don't want to be on it at all. So there are lots of symptoms that I think need to be addressed the way you would address, oh my gosh, I have pressure in my chest and my jaw hurts and my arm. You don't sit around and wait to see if you're going to feel that way again, or it's still in a week or two. You call 911 or you get, a test immediately and say, I think I'm having a heart attack. So it depends on the symptoms.
I know most of the people that I've connected with who are in recovery, a long-term recovery from substance use disorder, they all talk about how, first of all, they say, no one got to these group therapy options, whether it's, group therapy through a provider or a 12-step meeting. No one got there on a winning streak, right? We know that. But Terry, they all ended up alone. And they say the disease wants you isolated and alone. And I would imagine for people with real depression, that's probably common, right? Like you can't get out of bed, you can't leave the house. And you've been able to connect with so many people through your podcast. Is that oftentimes the first time they've been able to really relate to other people? Like, oh my goodness, this is my story and I haven't heard it before. And then like that's when the hope can start, right? You've been able to do that, haven't you?
I think anybody who shares their story publicly and honestly, and it doesn't have to be publicly. I don't know why I said publicly. It can be very, very privately. I think anyone who honestly and vulnerably shares their story does it. So I'm one of the people doing it. And giving somebody that safe space, right? Making it safe for them to share it was surprising how many people have said, how many guests have said, I've never told anybody this before. Even people who have done like TED Talks, and I don't dig, it's not 60 minutes. I'm not trying to, get into your family history and stuff if you don't want to talk about it. But they'll say, I've really never mentioned that my mother had attempted suicide or something, but I'm okay saying that. And I find that when I say I'm honored to do this work, I find it such an honor to be trusted. And I say that, it's not just telling me, it's telling me like this right now with you all, to put it out into the world, to put it on the internet. It is a brutal place. So, there's a lot of trust in that process. But I do think it's amazing. And I think that I see how this is changing. And the younger generations, I will say, in honor of my grayness, to hear them tell their stories, to hear them just like, oh yeah, I was supposed to go out last night, but I was really sad. And so I told my buddies and, they did this instead and brought over pizza. And you're like, wait, what? It has never in my life happened. It has never in my life happened. I've had a depression podcast for almost 8 years and my friends still don't ask me how I am, which shocks me. I thought at some point we'd have that discussion when we were getting together for a birthday or something, and somebody would say, so how would we know? How would we know if you weren't okay? And it's never happened. And I'm like, wow, still interesting. Okay. So yes, I think that when you say that people alone do think depression would love to have you alone. Nobody can be there to say, no, you're not worthless. No, we wouldn't be better off without you. Those things can't happen when you're alone. And I was alone. I had just moved into a log cabin out here alone. And that did not help. That did not shorten the length of my depression. It did not, raise the depth of my depression. Everything was against me. Being alone counted against me on every front. So I get that. When you're isolated, it's just you and your thoughts. And when your thoughts are in your own voice and they're convincing as hell, yeah, you're going to believe you have just lost your value as a human being if that's what you are hearing on a loop.
Yeah, well, just talking about how important community is, I'd love to know how you found some community when you were living out there in the log cabin and what you tell people as just like a low barrier to entry. Like, what's the first thing, first piece of advice? I'm also a woman in long-term recovery from alcohol use disorder. And when I work with women who are entering recovery, I suggest that they find one person and just get really honest. Like, it just needs to be one person so that you aren't the only keeper of your secrets, and therefore someone else can tell you that it's really no big deal. Like, you're not that so special. Yeah. What do you have to say about
or
that?
It is a big deal, but it's not just your big deal. What is my advice? I love what you said. I think that we need to be able to tell somebody, it gives it air, it gives it some light, and it's so bloody dark. But you have to be careful who that somebody is. I mean, it's not as if I did not say to people, I am really struggling. I could hardly come here. I could hardly get out of bed. I think about dying, and you get like, oh, that's not fun. I mean, no one received it or responded to it as medical. But I do think that so many people think, as I probably did, like, there's no one I can tell. Nobody understands it. Nobody gets it. That can be your reason to not tell anyone. And it gets worse in isolation, as you've said, Cliff. So I think that the person you tell doesn't even have to be someone in your physical circle. You can, in fact, tell it on a Facebook community page that you trust, that is well monitored, that you are not going to get the kind of comments that come on social media that will, or very likely could, make you feel worse. So I do think it's just being honest. And one of the pieces of advice I give is tell your doctor, because if you say the word psychiatrist, or you need help, or you should see a therapist, that can sound so judgmental. And it's like, I'm going to therapist. Next week's episode, when the guest's friend said, maybe you should see a shrink. And he said, what are you saying? What do you mean? I don't need a shrink. I'm not crazy. That's too easy to dismiss, so but you can tell your doctor, because we're used to telling our doctors when parts of us aren't working quite right, and it's like, yeah, and I don't know if I need to say this, but I think about dying all the time, in a welcoming way. And now they ask the questions. I suggest they be different, but nobody takes my suggestion. But I don't think they should say, do you think about killing or harming yourself? Because I didn't. So I would answer no to that question, and we would move on. If you said, do you think about dying? Do you ever wish that it would just all end? Oh, hell yeah. I would have said yes in a heartbeat to that. Even when I'm not in depression, it's almost like a muscle memory. There are times I'm on a plane or something, and I think, oh, if someone stood up and had a gun, and they were going to take it, I would just stand up. I would just take the bullet. And I'm like, oh, you still kind of have that, don't you? And, like, it's still in me. And I don't actually have things I'm very excited to live for, but that's still sort of back there.
I think you touched on a couple of things I want to go into. You were mentioning your friends and still the hesitancy and avoidance of even, checking in. I do feel that we're still, going through kind of like an uphill battle, with an ongoing battle, I would say, with the stigmas, that are associated with getting help. And I do see that as generational. So I am very thankful for the younger generations who are, stigmatizing the conversation and even being able to have it as part of normal day-to-day check-ins and, actions. So that's something for sure. I think my question to that is, how have you been able to navigate those generational stigmas, if at all? Is it just, through continued advocacy, or have there been other things that you would suggest to other people who might face the same in their own families and friends network?
I don't know what to say to somebody, another boomer to in any way change how their family treats them and it, because it just might be too late to really change that. It's like, I would like to inform you. What I did going back with my children, and they're in their 30s, when they were little, 3, 5, like little, I said to them, if your tooth hurts, we're going to go to a tooth doctor. Foot hurts, taking you to a foot doctor. So if your feelings are hurt and I'm unable to, be the person who's the right person to tell or talk to, or what I thought would work didn't, or you just need someone else that you can trust that it's okay to tell, we'll bring you to a feeling doctor. And I never called them a shrink or a therapist or anything that I thought if they said to their friends. And I'm sure that if they did tell their friends, they were like, feeling doctor. But my kids, it was just like, there are times something's up and you don't know what. And it's like, what? I don't think it's even maybe appropriate for me to be like, I can tell me, son, because he wasn't, for whatever reason. So then I'd be, I'm just going to bring you in to see Dr. C, and I'll be in the waiting room and we'll, grab some whatever on the way home for dinner. So I think that I started kind of retroactively destigmatizing it, and they both still see therapists, and it's just, I think everybody should. And I think a lot of us who are seeing therapists to talk about the people in our lives who would never see a therapist. So, I really do. But I think that there are lots of ways we can just, and I'll say now when someone says, can you, I say, oh God, it used to be like I wouldn't be good company. And now I would just say it if I was depressed and hope that they would, in some way respond or check back in the next day. But I'll ask people, if they say they can't, I say, okay, I have friends who are grieving and, say, are you grieving or are you depressed or do you not know? Because I would respond differently. Both of them require check-in. Both of them, I can drop something off both of them, lots of things, but there's also a difference.
Yeah. So I agree with your comments about the benefits of therapy and seeing someone, safe space. I can disclose everything, get advice, right? Get feedback from a different perspective. Mm-hmm. Individual and group therapy is wonderful. And I feel like more and more people could benefit from that. I had lots of good friends and I could, be expressive in relatively, safe places, right? Free of judgment. Mm-hmm. Definitely not with the willingness and ability to be vulnerable that the way I am today. But this is kind of a question for everyone here. I didn't see a therapist until I was 47 years old. And in 3 sessions, we unpacked so much. And it was absolutely wonderful. And it helped me a ton. But I see so many people that don't have one person in their life that they can have those discussions with. It's usually men, right? Who haven't even talked about these things ever with anyone. But is part of that too, because we're just not as connected as we used to be to other humans with, community organizations, whether it's formal religions or us just being together and breaking bread together and doing things together. Is that kind of where we're going? A lot of people don't have these one-on-one engagements with other humans where they're talking about real things. It's amazing in the substance use disorder recovery world, how many dudes have these lifelong friends that turn into, oh my God, they're just drinking buddies. All we ever talked about was the Packers. Right? Mm-hmm. That's it. Mm-hmm. Right. And it's we're missing out so much. So I don't know. It's the need for therapy increasing dramatically because our social lives and the way we engage or don't engage with each other is changing so much. Kind of a group question.
I want to chime in on that. I think one of my thoughts is, I don't think the need for therapy or therapists, mental health support, psychological support was decreased when we were, right? So, and I'm also going to make a statement there and say, if we rewind the clock and go back in time, I feel that we weren't in a society or culture that was conducive to discussing our mental health, not freely, not easily, without the connotations that were stigmatized. So are we living in a time now where maybe our social engagements have changed and evolved? And with that evolution, is it increasing our ability to have these conversations when we eventually do get to that place where we're breaking bread, as well as from a virtual or an online perspective?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. So yeah, Dr. Mala, do you think the stigma of I see a shrink, I see a therapist was kind of almost I'm an alcoholic? People would, really? Okay.
Yeah. You see it in the timeline of psychology. I actually teach this in my 101 classes, but one of the things that actually it was in the 90s, and you can see it in some of the textbooks. I remember in some of my older textbooks, they actually had a picture of Frasier, the show, because that was one of the first shows that came out where mental health and psychiatry and psychology was not framed from the context of shrink, right? The negative term. So it was in the 90s when that change started to happen. And I can list a whole bunch of Cengage textbooks that reference that. But yeah.
Cliff, one thought I had to your question was lots of us, and I include myself, not just, the dudes in your 12-step groups, but think I have had no one I could talk to. No one understood. And that's depression talking. It's also seems kind of true. I think that if we say, I can't tell you how often I speak somewhere and there's a line afterwards of people who come up and it's like, me too, or my husband, or my this, or my that. I think that sometimes we're all keeping the same secret from each other. And I think if we said, wow, I don't think this is just, I don't know. I don't think I'm just run down. I think this is something more, and I'm actually a little bit nervous about it. Someone else, again, I keep referring to next week's episode because this guy's so funny. And, in his world, it's you can't have to, I would never have thought he did. He would never have thought I did. And yet here the two of us were doing an interview about depression, laughing our heads off because we're funny and we have depression. They're two different things. They're two different parts of us. So sometimes we think we don't have anyone we can talk to because we don't talk. And sometimes I think when we do, you're going to know early on if they're the right person or not. And I love things like a podcast. I love things like a movie or an article that came out, or Simone Biles, or any little starter, because then you can say, hey, I heard she's seeing a therapist. I heard him say that his moodiness, his anger was actually a symptom of depression. And if the person's like, well, they're nuts, well, that's not your person. If they say, I never thought about it because I get angry really often with no apparent, stimulus for it. I wonder if, and now that's somebody you can talk with. And so I think we need to learn to access those, to grab a key and just see if it fits in this lock or this lock. And you don't have to expose too much. I'm not going to walk up to someone and say, I go to bed at night wishing I didn't wake in the morning. That's not a starting point, but if you can say, there's this mental health crisis in the youth, is that something that concerns you? You're a real good chance you're going to hear about something about their kids. And then you can bring it up.
Yeah. That reminds me. I got some really good advice recently from a friend, and I was sharing a bit of frustration about someone we care about, who we thought was being, I don't know if lazy is the right word, but just like not getting after it. And my procrastination, I was taught, can be a symptom of depression. And I didn't understand that. Right. Like that could be, Dr. Mala, is that common, right? Like people, they just can't get going. Right. And I had never even thought that.
Yeah. If you don't have any gas in your tank, how can you be like, yeah, I'm going to do it, Just some of the things I had to do. I had a mother in her 90s and, had to bring her to the doctor or had to bring her to the hospital or whatever it was, and driving, and doing it and coming back and walking. My bedroom is straight in from my front door, and I would walk straight to my bed and lay back. I would have my coat on. I live in Wisconsin. So, I'd have my hat, I might take my hat off. I would wake up hours later in my boots and my winter coat. It was like, it took every drop. So it's not that I was being lazy. It's not that you don't have it to expend. And it took everything. I probably took everything I had just to drive in. And then I had to do whatever it was I had to do. Then I had to drive back. And that was more than I had to give. So it really was shocking. It's not like I wake up and, drop and do 40 and then go for I'm not one of those people either. But I get up and I really hardly could. It felt literally physical, like a physical weight. I always thought of the X-ray things, like in a dentist chair. And, it's just this extra physically harder to sit up and get going, not just all the mental part that was also
feel heavy. Yeah, you feel weighed down. Yeah. No, what I was going to say, and that's such a true reflection. I think, Cliff, you might have somebody mentioned, even the other end, maybe it was you, Terry, where you mentioned the OCD factor. So anxiety, like plays a factor as well. But even with outside of anxiety, you're back into depression, people don't recognize that there is a spectrum, right? So there's the weighed down feeling all the way to the, I'm going to keep myself so busy, and fill my schedule, triple fill my schedule, and try to mask it, situation, which does have, propensities towards also those anxious, anxiety driven thoughts and behaviors. So I think it's important to recognize that, there is that spectrum, but arguably that spectrum is across many diagnoses, across many recovery journeys as well that we need to recognize. All right. So with all of that, when you were going through this, what was the beacon of light for you?
I don't think there was one until I went to the doctor. I really don't. I know there are people who just, I say you either swear at the thought of medicine or you swear by it. And, I think that I might be in that later camp. I say not being on any now, but I think it put a floor beneath my feet. I think I needed to address it like a medical condition. And, it was so long. And that when I went to my doctor, when I said it, and he was just very like, sounds like depression. Let's try, whatever milligrams of whatever. I was like 4 weeks. You know how little time 4 weeks is in 2 years? I was just like, oh, I remember her. Like, oh my God, she waited for me. She's still there. I'm still me. And by 6 weeks, I was like, oh, this is ridiculous. That's about when the idea of the podcast came to me. Because I was like, how many people, just by not addressing it, just by not naming it, just by not thinking it's okay to get treatment or that it's treatable or that it has a name, are losing. That is a lot of time to lose. If I was 10 and I lost it till 12, that would be a lot of time to lose. But I was in my 50s and, all of a sudden it was like, wow, like it's a different world. And I missed a lot of time. So I think that the light didn't come on until it came on in my head again. And I think that was medication. And it was a low dose and I wasn't on it forever. And I just encourage anybody to try anything healthy that's going to help, because we all, that when we talked in the very beginning, Cliff, the Venn diagram of substance being of self-medicating, when you feel terrible, you do something to feel less terrible. I just really encourage it. And one of my guests had the great phrase that you have to learn to love the thing you hate the least. And he hates his meds and he hates the way they make him feel and he hates the weight gain and he hates this and he hates that, but he hates wanting to die more. And, that's where I am. I stand firmly in as I said, I would go back on them today if I had to. So I think that for me, I know there's hereditary factors, which I guess is biological. I know there were hormonal factors. I know there were environmental factors. I guess with the pills, with, responding as I did to medication, that's probably, chemistry. You can read that it's a, chemical imbalance and you can read it. So is not. That's a big lie that pharmaceutical companies sell. For me, they worked.
You've kind of mentioned it, but how did your inner dialogue and narrative change? It sounds like, and I can hear, you felt lighter, you felt like you were connecting to yourself. So how did the narratives change?
Well, it's interesting because when you first asked, my mind went one place and then I realized it's the narrative that stopped. It was the loop that stopped. It wasn't, you have lost your value as a human being. You are worthless. You will always feel this way. You have nothing to contribute to the world. Nobody would care if you were dead. That is a lot to have go away. That is, on hands and knees praising whomever and whatever. So glad that went away because I can live with all the other symptoms. That is just water dripping on your forehead. And it was, I won't say 24 hours a day, but as little as I slept, it was a lot more than I wanted. and to just have it shut up so I could have my own thoughts. And they weren't like, oh, that butterfly is beautiful and pollination is a gift. I mean, I don't go there. I'm not a rainbows and butterflies kind of gal. I was a crime reporter and now I do a depression podcast. So, I kind of lean toward the dark side, but I could acknowledge that the sun was out. And, I guess that's the dialogue stopped probably more than the dialogue started.
I love that. So if depression has taught you one thing that you would pass on to our listeners and to others, what would that be? When
you say you're not alone, people just hate hearing that. And I would have hated hearing that because I was so very alone. Don't tell me I'm not alone. Like nobody was here. Not alone in the experience. It's not as catchy, but it's true. I think that it's a medical condition that's common and treatable. I think if we just take it out of there's something wrong with you, because, I had COVID really badly. And we know there are an awful lot of people who died. We also know there are people who are like, it was like a mild flu. Well, same with depression, same with everything. There's that. I had it bad enough that I was in the hospital a couple of times. But I remember afterwards, there was a cognitive delay afterwards. I mean, I definitely... I want to see what I was calling myself things that I had never called myself before. And I was like, oh, is this what it's like to not have, I don't want to use labels, to not have the ability to think that I used to have. And I thought, is this how I'm going to be now? Am I going to have trouble accessing words? Am I going to have trouble speaking, which is an issue with a podcast. And I walked by a neighbor and I asked him the color of the paint because I was repainting my house. And I said, so is the color of the small building where you keep your car the same color as your house? And he looks at me and goes, the garage. And I was like, see, I couldn't. And he said, did you have COVID? And I said, yeah. And he said, real high fever? I said, yeah. He goes, oh, took me about 6 months for word access to come back. Took my buddy more than a year and he lost his job, but it comes back. And I was just like, that's what we need to do. That's what we need to do, whether it's substance use disorder or an addiction or depression or anxiety. It's like, once we treat it that way, it's like, yes, oh yeah, that's a common experience. I had it too. Here's how it affected me. This might be true for you. It's a really long answer to what was a pretty precise question. Sorry, Dr. Mala. But I think that, just talking about it and realizing that it's treatable and common really, really helps because it takes away the stigma, it takes away the self-blame. It's not just because I'm a really worthless human. It's because I mean, if you look at the risk factors, check. Like I wasn't getting out of life without depression. There was no way. It was an arrow shot right to the bullseye. For me, it just every single thing about my upbringing, childhood traumas, biology, parents' not diagnoses, all of it. I was going to get depression and then getting divorced and moving away from everybody and going through menopause just said, oh, now is when it's going to be the worst. What's one of the most surprising things you've learned about mental health since starting the podcast? Oh, two things popped in my mind, but the first is that the people with it are pretty cool. I mean, I actually, this week's podcast is it this week's? Yeah. Dr. Tim Cantifer, he calls depression the curse of the strong. And he says that people who, for whatever reason, by about 18, didn't have a real strong sense of self or self-confidence and were raised to believe that they had to take care of other people are really at risk for it. And again, more of the check boxes. But when I talk to people with depression, which I do often, I would have coffee with any one of them. And I would love to get to know them better. I find them absolutely fascinating because they're in their heads so much. They know themselves fairly well. And that makes for an interesting conversation because unexamined people tend to have a different kind of conversation with. And then the other thing would be just the different, I used to call them flavors, but that sounds like I'm making it less than it is. But, I thought my experience of depression was the experience of depression. And I'm kind of the flat one. I'm not so sad. I'm just nothing. I think maybe it was why I was a good reporter because, I could be in some pretty wild circumstances and not feel a whole lot. But that, of course, means you're not feeling the good either so much. And that's not on meds. That's just always. But some people, as I say, get really angry. Didn't know anger. Didn't know anger was a symptom. I never knew that until I started interviewing people and doing my research. And then there's the very, very sad. To think that you can have thoughts of dying without considering yourself really sad sounds odd now that I hear it come out of my mouth. But I have never thought of myself as a sad person. But boy, I was just flat.
Yeah, it's really interesting, Terry. Like, you are so far from flat affect. And spending
Thanks.
some time with you, and you exhibit joy, and you have such a tremendous sense of humor, and you're lively, and all of those things. It's just the power of these diseases. It's amazing to think. I think the same way of Amanda, right? Like, some of the stories she shared, like, I cannot picture Amanda being the way that she was. And it's so awesome to see you where you are today, and to be doing this awesome work that you're doing. So we are the lucky ones.
Thanks. Delighted to be part of the team.
Great. So what are some of the common threads that you've heard as you've explored other people's journeys and stories that I think sometimes go missed?
Oh, I think it might be that how long it is between when you start experiencing symptoms and anybody notices, including you, enough to think that maybe it needs to be addressed. And I think, as with some other illnesses, I think it's gone from 10 to 11 years now. But if you think about that, I mean, if we were having the symptoms of stroke or heart attack, or, and it doesn't have to be the crisis, but heart issues, asthma, if you like, whoa, when I run, this happens, or when I just walk now, this, and people go like, yeah, give it a decade and see how I mean, what, it just wouldn't happen. So I think that is one of the things, just that length of time. So many people say, thinking back, and I was a really, sad kid, or high school was just brutal. And, I remember this and this and this and this, but it wasn't until I was graduating from college or married or had my first child and was diagnosed with PPD, postpartum depression. I think that's a really common thread. I just think there was so little awareness of what was going on, or willingness to talk about it. Or perhaps sometimes in families, parents felt like if you were depressed, that meant I wasn't providing the things that would make you happy, or I wasn't being a loving enough parent that you feel all the goodness that life, can provide. And yeah, that also doesn't make any sense if you think of it as an illness, because you wouldn't say to someone, oh my gosh, how did you have the flu and I'm such a great mom? That's just ridiculous. I think that's one of them.
I love how you phrase that. It's so true. And, I'm so thankful that you're advocating this way, with the use of the language, where that helps with the destigmatizing, If you're going to the, heart doctor for your heart problems, then why is it any different if you're going to the brain doctor for your brain problems and afflictions, so absolutely.
Right.
And thank you for, sending that message out there and reinforcing that as well.
I have a million things I want to talk to Terry about, and we'll do that offline.
Yeah, same here.
Let's have lunch.
Same here. So much. And I just got a strong swell of gratitude for having amazing teammates. And being a part of this. So thank you. Somehow this took me there, and it's wonderful. So thank you.
Well, you started with not having a great day, so I hope this.
Yes. Oh man, I forgot about that right here. That's
good.
For sure.
You already. That's awesome.
Thank you.
Power of community. I did want to say one thing that I've been thinking about a lot, which is, storytelling is so important, and even more important, I think, is truth telling. And when storytelling is truthful storytelling, it's the best of everything. So you, Terry, do such a beautiful job of truth telling in your story. And I think every time we hear truth, it inspires other people to speak theirs. So I'm just grateful for you, grateful to know you, and for you shining your light in the world.
If I can tell one quick story about that, there was a father who had not talked about his depression, including to his family. I think his partner, his wife knew, but not his children. And he was suicidal and brought himself to a hospital to keep himself safe. In the hospital, I think he was listening to the podcast, but he said to his wife, I'll know I'm better when I'm a guest instead of a listener. And a while after he got out of the hospital, he reached out to me and said, I would like to tell my story. And I was like, let's do it. So we did. And then his son, who had known he was in the hospital, but had not previously talked to him about his depression, said, I also have depression. And now that we're both talking about it, let's be each other's support. And the son wanted to do an episode about how he and his father had this really intimate conversation after he was released from the hospital, and how now they're each other's support networks. And you're like, it's that truth, right? You hear it and you're like, it's safer for me now. And that's just like, to be part of that circle is just, it's just beautiful. It's just the best. I feel when people tell me their stories, I don't like I'm like you, Cliff. I don't want to hear about the weather. I don't want to hear about the Packers. I can look out the window. I can look up the score. It's like, I want to know who you are and what makes you tick and what's hard for you and what's easy for you. And like, I do want to have real conversations, and I get paid to have real conversations and not to make people feel safe. I don't do anything, but to create a safe space so they can be honest. And then, hello, I mean, I love that. It's so cool. It's such a nice thing to be able to do. And it's when I hear them, I'm like so inspired. I learn so much. There isn't a person I've interviewed in 400 some interviews that I haven't learned from. And so I'm so much better able to handle my depression because I know all their little tricks. I know the phrases they've used. I know one guy just said some wrench of his was crooked and he couldn't fix an engine or a clock or whatever he was doing. He said, you can't fix something that's broken with something that's broken. And so when I start to feel it I think, I know I can't fix my brain with my brain. I can't think myself through this because they're both broken at this point. So, it's just people being people and being there for each other. And that's the most we can hope for.
Well, last question. What does recovery mean to you?
I guess I don't want to say wanting to live again, because that sounds so sad and extreme. But reconnecting with life, reconnecting with all of it. There's still the bad. There's still the things you want to avoid. There's still the hard. There's still the stressful. There's still all of it. But there's also the good stuff. And I just couldn't access the good stuff before. I couldn't recognize it. It wasn't for me. So that'll be my answer.
Thank you. So beautiful. Terry, absolutely has been an honor and a pleasure to have you on. And
thank you all.
We're so excited for our continued discussions. Yeah, where can people find you? We've got the Giving to Voice Depression podcast, but how else can they find you?
I think if they just search Giving Voice to Depression, they'll find all the players, Spotify and Apple and all the players where the weekly episodes are. GivingVoiceToDepression.com is our website. And if you're on Facebook, the Giving Voice to Depression Facebook page is a community that is just remarkable. And Sarah, shout out to Sarah, who monitors it like it's her own child. And I make sure that it is safe and responsive. And if anybody writes anything negative, which seldom happens, it's only up there for, a minute or two before one of us notices it. So I think those are pretty much the big ones. We post every day across social media just to keep positive or real mental health messaging top of mind.
Sure. No, I love it. And we'll definitely include those in our posts as well. So thank you for sharing that. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode of the Recovery.com podcast. For additional information, resources, and to access treatment options, please visit our website at Recovery.com. We appreciate your listenership and are excited to have you join us on our next show coming soon.